Welcome, everybody. This is the Bay Area Book Festival's panel on New Visions for Conservation. My name is Toby McLeod. I'll be your moderator today. I'd like to remind everybody to turn off your cell phones, please. And want to thank the Federated Indians of Grayton Rancheria for their sponsorship. And they have helped make this whole event possible. So let's give them a round of applause. And also, I'd like to mention that all three of our authors will be signing books at Sausalito Books by the Bay, which is in a tent by the park, starting at 4:45. So you can all go get the books and talk to these wonderful people and get signatures and all that. I'm an environmental filmmaker and work out of the David Brower Center across the street. I've worked for 40 years making films about Indigenous peoples' battles with uranium mining and coal mining and being protectors of water and sacred sites. And I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Lejeune Ohlone land here in Berkeley. I've been working for the last few years to help protect the West Berkeley Shell Mound site, the 5,000-year Ohlone village here in Berkeley. And it's a relevant topic because it's something that we'll be talking about some here today in terms of Indigenous peoples' contributions to the future and how they have values and practices and beliefs and traditional science that holds a key to our future if we only will listen. So we have three wonderful panelists today, an Indigenous scientist who is redefining what science means and who beautifully teaches history while explaining the importance of Indigenous knowledge, an economist whose book, ostensibly about forests, also weaves in the history of planet Earth and many battles around forests, and shows a lot of deep respect for the people who live within those forests. And also, finally, an artist who paints on dried seaweed and whose succinct stories aim at breaking through climate paralysis and our general failure to understand how our oceans are suffering. And Christina Conklin is an artist, writer, and researcher who truly loves the ocean. You can tell from her beautiful book, The Atlas of Disappearing Places, Our Coasts and Oceans in the Climate Crisis, and lives near the ocean in Half Moon Bay, and who challenges us through her book to understand the climate crisis so that we can react to it in a constructive way on a personal level and at a social level. So Christina, would you like to start us off and help us understand what's going on in the oceans and the creatures who live in the ocean and the people who live nearby?
Thank you. I have a few slides to share. I guess I won't be mic'd if I'm standing up there, but I'll speak loudly, or maybe I can...
Do you want me to advance your slides?
Yeah, sure. That would be probably better. Okay. Yes, it's just the right button. Well, this is the book title. Actually, the cover image, I'll say a word about it, is a map of the Thames River estuary in England. And to give you a sense, the darker areas are the populated areas, and the red areas are the flood line coming in the next decades. So the whole book is about this intersection. Well, half the book is about the intersection of shoreline and peoples and the sea level rise to come. And then the other half of the book is really about the deep ocean and the ecosystems and the creatures who live there. So you can go to the next slide. So this is one of my maps on seaweed. It's an image of the entire ocean. It was only in 1979 that a cartographer decided to see the ocean whole rather than splitting it up to see the land. So he drew an axis between Argentina and China, made a small cut at the Bering Strait, which of course was a land bridge historically. And this is what the ocean is. And so it's part of my book is about how do we reorient ourselves to the natural world? How do we remember our place in nature as part of nature? And to me, this tells that story, right? How do we see the ocean whole? So things that are happening far away are also happening very close. This is Antarctica. The ice stream speed has increased 10 times over in the past 50 years. So that's the red. The maps I transcribed onto the sea lettuce are direct transcriptions from scientific studies, and I wanted to do that to highlight the science, and the language was always that red equals danger, and I thought this would be a book of blues and greens and soft tones, and it's a lot of hot, frightening colors. So yes, you can go to the next slide. And again, so this is ocean warming, comparing the last half of the 20th century to the last half of the 21st century, what's projected. Anywhere from basically 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit to upwards of 10 degrees Fahrenheit in the dark red areas. And the hard part, the tragic part, the part we all have to sit with in presence and grief, and then turn toward action, is that a lot of these changes are going to continue to happen no matter what we do. But we do have power to slow and change the speed and trajectory of the change. So this will change every ecosystem in the ocean and every scale of plant life and animal life in the ocean. But we still have time to change the story moving forward. So I'm a primarily visual artist, and really it was important to me to look at culture as a major player in how we tell these stories, and what do different cultures around the world have to say. This is a map of the Shinto shrines in the Nagoya Bay that will be drowned by sea level rise by the end of the century. And every white dot is a Shinto shrine. So I was a religious studies major in college. I looked to belief systems around the world for guidance, and to help us point the way. And so the most holy shrine in all of Japan is down at the bottom there. There's a slightly larger dot, but it's right at the edge of projected sea level rise in the coming century. But it's been around since the year 600, and it's rebuilt every year out of holy trees grown in sacred groves by hand in exact replica. And to me, honoring that level of that history, that tradition, that culture, these are really big deal questions we have to be answering in the coming decades. Like, what are we going to allow to happen, and what are we going to save? Another major issue is in extractive industrial capitalism, right? The root cause. And this is a picture of the Cook Islands, which are 5 tiny islets in the South Pacific with a population of 15,000 people. They're a nation of Polynesian ancestry. And industrial miners are coming and waving billions of dollars to say, can we scrape the bottom of your territorial waters for manganese and create you into a super wealth, a super fund. And the battle in a small community, this tiny nation, between environmental activists and political players, and where does power lie, and what does value mean? So that was one of the stories I wanted to tell in this. And every chapter has a view from 2050. So basically a perspective or a way to propose what could happen, both from in a hopeful and also realistic way. And in this particular instance, the reality is that I proposed, or my future fiction was that the government eventually caved into pressure and allowed the mining to happen. And that happened sooner than projected. It happened this year. In reality. And here we are in San Francisco Bay. The chapter on the bay is about toxic pollutants and where we build our infrastructure and industry and landfills. And every one of those dots is either a Superfund site or a polluted site, a chrome plating site, a landfill. And the blue is the 3-meter flood line. So if we have a major storm or as sea levels rise, of course, we've filled in the bay by this much in the last 150 years. The original bay line was, lots of salt marshes and floodable lands. And so this is our future. We have to be able to look cleanly and clearly at these realities and make some hard choices. And those are, the stories. I believe I tried to include hopeful possibilities, pragmatic possibilities, some things that are actually already happening, new ways of storytelling and imagining a future. But we're facing some really pretty tough odds right now, and so I try not to duck those facts either.
Thanks, Christina. Next, we'll hear from John Reid, an economist whose book, Evergreen, Saving Big Forests to Save the Planet, continues more than 40 years of work John has committed to conservation, to use economic insights to protect natural ecosystems. John is currently on the staff at Nia Tero, whose mission is to work in solidarity with Indigenous people who sustain thriving territories and cultures to strengthen guardianship of Earth and all beings. And John, I guess we'd love to hear from you about why you wrote your book and how the megaforests of the planet potentially hold an incredibly important part of our future if we treat them right. And I'll advance the slide for you when you tell me to.
Okay. Thanks, Toby. It's great to be on the panel here with Jessica and Christina. And thanks to all of you folks for coming out to hear about this stuff. And I guess I'll start by saying that I'm not old enough to have been at my job for 40 years, but it's been about 30. And in the conservation world. And I feel like I'm still learning how we need to do this work of living on Earth and living with the non-human beings. And I come from here. I come from the Bay Area, and I grew up in a culture of environmentalism that had its roots in 19th century Romanticism and a vision of wilderness that really was a landscape emptied of its people and dangerous animals. I started going to work overseas in developing countries where neither the Romanticism nor the idea of empty demographic voids seemed to make sense to people. And so the approach to conservation had to be much more pragmatic. But the pragmatism, I think, often made the mistake of going straight to a sort of an instrumental take on nature. Like, what is nature doing for people in dollars and cents? In the intro, I'm identified as an economist, and I have that training, but it's not the core of my identity. And I think it comes in for a lot of deserved criticism. But we need to be doing something different from gazing at nature with this reverential look, and also different from saying, well, what did nature do for me lately? And so that's backdrop for a question that I came to a few years ago, which is that there are still great, huge, beautiful, thriving places on our planet, which is good news. And it's not news that always makes it to a general audience. You know, what we tend to hear is how much of the Amazon burnt down this year, or how Siberia is on fire. And I wanted to bring back the inspirational fact that there are still thriving, huge forest ecosystems on our planet, and also to make the point that we can't solve climate change without them. We can't solve our extinction crisis without them. And if we lose them, we're going to severely narrow the collective human ability to think. There are about 2,000 languages that are rooted in intact forest ecosystems in the world, with way more than 2,000 words for forests. or with no word for forest at all because the concept doesn't exist. And so we need those codes to, blow our minds about what it is we're talking about and how to solve the problems in the future. So, the book has a kind of Save the Whales sort of a title, but really it tries to be more nuanced about how do we get to solutions. And so what Tom Lovejoy and I tried to do in the book was bring as many voices in as we could and learn through a process of engaging those voices and having them help guide us. So that's sort of how it came about, and look forward to the discussion. Yeah. And we don't really need to go through the rest of the slides.
Thanks, John. Dr. Jessica Hernandez is a Maya, Chorti, and Zapotec indigenous scholar and scientist who's working in the Pacific Northwest. She founded Pina Sol, an environmental consulting firm that supports Black and Indigenous-led conservation and environmental projects through mutual aid and micro grants. And she earned a PhD, which was a struggle in the academic world of America, from the University of Washington. And her amazing book, Fresh Banana Leaves, Healing Indigenous Landscapes Through Indigenous Science, is also an amazing history lesson, I think, for North Americans who don't know much about El Salvador and Guatemala and Mexico and the kind of settler colonial contrasts to what has happened here further north in North America. And she has made a powerful case that things are not going to change unless Indigenous voices and the intimate knowledge of the natural world shared by most Indigenous communities are centered and heard and respected and incorporated in our policies going forward. And I think in thinking of the many questions I'd like to ask you, I feel like the title Fresh Banana Leaves is sort of the obvious place to go, because it's both a metaphor but also a deeply personal story of you and your father, and the fact that without banana leaves you wouldn't be here. So could you start by telling that story and then share a little bit about your journey writing this book? Thank you.
So Wendell Padichi Biguri, it's an honor to be here on these Indigenous lands that foster me as an Indigenous scholar. I attended the University of California, Berkeley when I was an undergrad. I'm also coming to you from Duwamish lands, also known as Seattle, named after Chief Sealth. So thank you for the question, and it's an honor to be here on this panel today. So I want to bring in my father to this space because he inspired me to write this story. So I will read a quote that starts the introduction for Fresh Banana Leaves. I will read. I am Victor Manuel. I'll now carry the last name Hernandez because, like the war fractured my country, it fractured my identity. I had to adopt a new last name because everything was burned during the Civil War, including the alcaldía, where they held all of our birth certificates. I was 11 years old when I fought in the war that devastated my country of El Salvador. So this story kind of embodies what conservation is and how conservation has displaced Indigenous peoples throughout Abya Yala or Turtle Island, known as the Americas. And one of the reasons why I entitled this story Fresh Banana Leaves is because while this is considered a war, it was actually a genocide enacted against Indigenous Mayan communities, also my Maya Chorti community. And one of the reasons why this title came about was through the story that my father shared with me. And that's the story that embodies the teaching that nature protects us as long as we protect nature. When he was 11, he was forced to join the guerrilla. When you were 10 and beyond, they were forcefully recruiting Indigenous children to fight in this war. The children had to choose whether they wanted to fight in the army side or in the guerrilla side to support their Indigenous causes, to reclaim their lands, and also to go against the oppression they were facing after the government decided to sell our lands through land grabs, through international agricultural corporations that introduced monoculture, or what we know as farming today. So during this time period, my father had to, as a child, leave behind his childhood and kind of experience that genocide. So oftentimes when we talk about genocide for many indigenous peoples, it's not something that's in the past. For me, I can trace the genocide to my father's generation. So the reason why I entitled the book Fresh Banana Leaves was because during the Civil War, my father's guerrilla encampment was bombarded. And one of the first things that he recalls doing as a 14-year-old, because this was 3 years into being in the guerrilla and the war, he went under to seek refuge under a banana tree. And this banana tree, he had built a great relationship with the banana tree. This was his playground. This was how he was able to escape the reality that he was facing during that time. So he rushed under the banana tree, and instead of the bomb igniting as it fell on the banana tree, the leaves wrapped themselves in a way that it prevented the bomb from igniting. And I think that, the teaching is that as long as we protect nature, nature will protect us. And unfortunately, during this case, right, it was during one of the worst human things that we can do, right, which is commit a genocide, commit a war, go into war. And I think that, we can see that today in this time frame because, we're seeing wars happen across the globe. And as a result of that, right, my father taught me that, this banana tree kind of protected him. And it's the reason why it allowed him to escape and eventually seek refuge in the United States, which, it's important to also acknowledge that this country kind of supported that genocide, right? Because it provided the government with the army, with the militia, with the training that was very violent to kind of enact this. So I think that, it kind of plays an interesting role in my life because we were displaced to this country, but this country also took a big, role and played a big part in enacting this genocide. So even today, a lot of grief, a lot of healing that we have to do is because, we're uncovering a lot of graves of our indigenous children who were massively murdered during this war. And I think that, it's a hard story to tell, but I think that it's an important story to tell because that's how we can learn, move forward and heal our indigenous landscapes, right? Is by learning those histories that have been hidden when it comes to indigenous peoples and uplifting our voices, even though that might be uncomfortable for many of us. So thank you for having me here today. And I'm hoping to have a great conversation with my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Jessica. What I'd like to do is ask each of you a follow-up question and encourage you to have a conversation amongst yourselves if you want to chime in. And then we'll have at least 10 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. But Jessica, I'd like to stay with you because you write about ecological grief and you beautifully lay out your own personal struggles with the world that you've had to endure and getting a PhD and the story of your father. And I just wonder if you could share a sense of, you've written a book now about it, you call out settler colonialism, you challenge all of us who are privileged to sort of come to terms with our own position in the world and then try to use it for benefit as we confront some of this history. Do you feel that your interactions with people, your conversations, the writing of the book is encouraging that conversation and is going to help heal some of that grief that we all feel from this history?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think that we are in that gray area, like I usually tell people, because we're in that gray area because we're seeing how this presidential administration is finally acknowledging indigenous peoples. He finally passed on May 5th, it's officially a day where we raise awareness for our missing and murdered indigenous women and peoples. We're also seeing how he's pushing the narrative so that we can include traditional ecological knowledge that I like to refer to as indigenous science into environmental policy. So for those of us, right, going into that question, we are in that gray area where we have to decide what role we're going to play into those discussions, right? Are we going to be continuing to push that forward so that these move from presidential memorandums into laws that are enacted so that we can reclaim back our lands? And when we hear the land back movement, right, it's important to mention that that's not going to displace people. It's rather going to allow indigenous peoples to steward and caretake for their indigenous lands so that we can move forward collectively and heal from that trauma that we embody, right? Because one of the things that it's important to mention in my cultures is that our landscapes and our environments carry our memories. So moving forward, they can also carry our healing. And I think that, it's important to keep that in mind. Thank you for that question.
Oh, thanks. John, you advocate for protected areas in each of the 5 megaforests, and you recount, as also Jessica does, some of the bad history of national parks, basically evicting the native people who lived there when the scientists came in to protect biodiversity. Can you give us an example of a good model of a protected area that begins to hold the carbon and respect the people who live there, but actually give them management, Indigenous, ownership and rights over their own territories that may still sometimes be held by governments? Can you outline some of the principles that are important if protected areas are actually going to be a positive solution?
Sure. Thanks for the question. So a clarification and then a small correction. The clarification is that we had a desire not to just give a laundry list of things that would be good policy ideas, but to focus on the ones that would be the most important and the most impactful. So we lead with recognition of Indigenous guardianship and land rights. We follow with protected areas. And then last, but by no means least, we talk about the problem of infrastructure that's irresponsibly built into intact ecosystems. And as one of the biggest irreversible things that's done to begin to fragment these landscapes. With respect to protected areas, we do not advocate for them in New Guinea. Because New Guinea is an island in the, maybe you could advance the slide just so people who don't know where New Guinea is can see it. So New Guinea is an island in the Western Pacific that is still 90% held by its traditional landholders in traditional landholding systems, which are different from ownership. Protected areas have been a disaster there. And they're not needed because these, the point is, where is there a system of collective land stewardship? That's what we need. Where it's working, there's no need to come in with 20th century substitute for it. So there are settings where protected areas are needed and have been done badly. They've been sort of, maps drawn up in offices. And this is done for mining, it's done for protected areas, it's done for logging, it's done for any number of different visions of what the landscape should be for by people who don't have a traditional connection to it. So particularly in Africa and in East Asia, and well, throughout Asia, this has been a big problem where there are a couple examples that we talk about in the book. I've spent most of my time working in South America, in Brazil and the neighboring countries. And in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a huge sort of boom of innovation in categories of protected areas that accommodated the economies that already existed there. And these were extractive economies of people who were using the forests, using the waterways, in ways that were time-tested and sustainable. Protected areas gave some official protection to those economies. And so they were a way of providing some insulation from when the mining industry arrives, when the logging industry arrives. There are some rules in place that enshrine the local economic system. There are a couple of cases that we talk about in the book where Indigenous communities actually requested or embraced the idea of a national park on top of their land. One is in the Bikin watershed in the Russian Far East, and one is in a place called Yagoque Apaporis in Colombia, where for the similar reasons that I was just referring to, the designation of a national park that didn't change the rules of traditional land use was an additional protection, including a protection from the community itself. Because as I've seen in my work, communities can be divided, corrupted, their integrity eroded by people who show up with money, people who show up with guns and money. And so these, parks have been used in that way to sort of be a protection against that. And I'll briefly say Canada is really innovating in this area with Indigenous protected areas.
Thank you. Christina, we promised hope, right?
Don't lay it on me.
Well, no, I actually want to talk a little bit about grief as a way to get to hope, because I imagine in dealing with climate change so intimately with all the facts that you feel a lot of sadness. And I'm similar to ecological grief that Jessica talked about. And I just wondered if you talk about your own process of dealing with that grief, sharing it with us so that we can think about how it's necessary to go through our grief to get to hope, and how that journey has gone for you.
It's a very good question. I feel like I had to abstract it all a little bit to write the book, to do all the research, because it gets into every corner of the world, every issue that's facing the ocean, every coastal, crisis waiting to happen, everything from climate refugees to the melting permafrost in the Arctic. So in that way, I had to armor myself a little bit. But since finishing the research for the book, I really have gotten involved in the regenerative culture movement, and folks who are working very, very hard in every sphere, from the arts to agriculture to law and civil society, to build regenerative systems that are actually bioregional, that build the land, sea, and soil, and don't degrade it anymore. So my hope is in the research for the book. My hope was in learning about all the wonderful things that are actually already happening in law and sometimes in policy. Certainly not at the national level where you would hear about it, but the rights of nature movement is really fascinating and building momentum. Citizen activism is really building momentum in the 4 years since I've started the book. Like the awareness has shifted so much, the conversation has shifted dramatically. So, and I think it comes down to this really fundamental fact of being willing to look the facts straight in the face and to not be in denial anymore. And I think the news and reality are bringing that to people's front doors and phone screens. So that that shift is really important. And I think the other piece of hope that I have is that climate change is nonlinear. It's going to really scale really, really quickly in a couple decades here. But so can social change, can be nonlinear, and nonlinear movement is what we require at this time. But it's also the nature of systems out of balance, change at rapid scales and rates, and we can be each be part of that change for the better.
I would encourage any of you who have burning questions for each other to please feel free to go for it.
Christina, the beauty of your book is important. I think it's important that we do this work about desperate things with style. And I just wanted to ask you about the process of making art, making beautiful objects about difficult situations.
Well, I think part of what was important to me was that the maps are made with water-soluble inks on dried seaweed, so they are as impermanent as this glass of water. Like they will dissolve if they're very, very ephemeral. And to me, that was really critical to this dialogue of, where are we in time? What do we really know? I think modern culture has given us this real sense of security and permanence that is illusory. We need to get back in touch with that fact. And so I think the materials I worked with and the way of working with them was a key piece of this. Beauty is impermanent. It's all ephemeral. As one of the speakers in the last session I was just listening to, she said everything is dying. And, that's a hard thing to know. We don't like to know it in this culture in particular, but it's time to have those conversations, and it can be done well with care and compassion, and also the hope that comes with that honesty.
On that theme, Jessica, one of the surprising things about your book was the theme of textiles and the tradition of women weaving and the ecological knowledge that's embodied in the beautiful textiles. I was also surprised to learn that the Zapatista movement was actually led by Comandante Ramona, a woman, which none of us up here heard about. Why are women's values and the knowledge of women part of the solution?
Mm-hmm. So I think it's important, right, to also mention what women and others are facing during this time period, right, especially with the loss. And I think that through ecofeminism, we understand that women have a stronger relationship with nature. Also, in our Zapotec community, we also have a third gender known as muses, who embody both feminine and masculine identities, which is, sometimes known as two spirits in many tribes in the United States. And I think that, with our textiles, we use them as canvas, our huipiles, our embroideries, to kind of manifest the beauty that we see in nature, to use natural resources from our environments to make our regalia. Unfortunately, I'm not wearing one today. But, we are able to kind of capture, the beauty, right, that comes from our flowers, from our native plants, from our flora, our fauna as well. And I think that part of that is because we are taught that we are part of nature in our creation stories, and it differs on the tribe or community. Our deities and gods created us from the natural elements, from the plants and the animals, and also the abiotic, the non-living elements as well. So I think that that's why we embody our nature through our, traditional regalia, our huipiles, our clothing as Indigenous peoples.
Thank you. I don't know if there's a microphone for questions from the audience, because since we're videotaping, I think we need a microphone. Are there questions in the audience? Yeah, Steve. Is there a microphone for questions, or
I just borrowed one of these last
Good move.
Thank you, John. John, you referred to the dichotomy between the romantic view of nature and the utilitarian one, and that's captured in our public lands in the United States. John Muir's national park system, inspired by his romantic values about nature, and the utilitarian national forest. Well, I'm wondering, and Jessica, I'd like to hear what you have to say about this too. It's pretty well understood that the national forest has been destroyed through our management practices over a century, including fire suppression. And there's growing recognition that cultural fire is needed to restore forest health. So what are the other ways in which indigenous management would restore the forests of North America, in addition to cultural fire, if the native people of those places were able to have management control?
Well, I don't have an authoritative answer to that question. I do, in my day job, work with the Blackfeet people, and they have been very influential on the neighboring national forest, which is still covered under rights that they didn't cede in the treaty that created the reservation. And they fought a battle for 30 years to keep natural gas drilling out of the Lewis and Clark National Forest, and succeeded. And it was that's because this area, which is called the Badger 2 Medicine, is sacred. Not that there are so many unsacred places in their territory, but that's one example. And now what some in the tribe are doing is working to reintroduce buffalo into the landscape. Although much of the tribe's livelihood now is cattle ranching, because that's the animals that were available when they needed to survive. So those are just examples that I'm familiar with because of my personal contact with them. But I'm going to pass the mic to Jessica for further comments.
Let's see. I think that, I think it's important to make that a little bit more place-based. So for instance, if we're talking about protecting the forest in this area, talking to the local indigenous peoples, I know that in Seattle, in the Coast Salish lands and territories, our western red cedar is actually dying off because of climate change. We're seeing a lot of root rot, and we're also seeing a lot of parasitic infections. So oftentimes, urban parks and the national parks kind of has moved away from replanting western red cedar because not all of them survive, unfortunately. So I think that it's looking back at like the bigger picture, right? Climate change, and how do we mitigate? Because I think like going back to what we're discussing, right? We're seeing a lot of things die off. And unfortunately, the western red cedar, it's an essential tree to the Coast Salish communities in, the state of Washington, the Pacific Northwest. And if they were to lose that, they're losing a part of their indigeneity because, and also their relative. But so like going back to grieving, they're going to be grieving their relatives. So I think that, it's important for us to take action to mitigate climate change impacts, especially localizing them to the communities, the indigenous peoples of those lands. But, that's a case that I would like to, mention with our western red cedar. And, the Coast Salish people do a lot of their regalia using western red cedar, a lot of their hats, their traditional hats, their baskets. And I think that, it's unfortunately that we're seeing that with, that magnificent tree and those forests of western red cedar. Thank you for your question.
Just to add one other example, the Coyote Valley Band of Pomo at this moment are demanding that the state of California enter into co-management of our largest state forest, which is the Jackson Demonstration State Forest. And it's 50,000 acres of redwood land where you have, pretty much 90% of redwoods are in private hands and managed for short rotation timber. They're asking for a different view of the forest, which is public land, and to get indigenous views involved in that management, not just because they have sacred sites there, but they have a different way of conceptualizing what we need out of forests and how we need to relate to them in this era.
Any other questions? There's one back there.
Yeah, this is a question for Jessica. I did want to thank you for posing very powerfully, actually, the need to confront the bitter history and that people have gone through caused by this government and this system, that we can't get anywhere without fully confronting that. I think that's important, but that's not my question. My question is this. You made the point, I think, that without centering indigenous knowledge and practice, we're not going to get out of this ecological catastrophe. And I think that's true. I also think we also need, whatever you want to call it, modern science, which has in fact unfolded what is going on with climate change. And so these are sometimes seen as antagonisms. I don't think they should be. I wondered if you could speak to that.
As a climate scientist and somebody who teaches at the university level, I think that one of the things that I prioritize is always teaching the history, behind Western science. Because, for instance, when we look at navigations, Europeans didn't necessarily they were not the pioneers in navigation. They kind of borrow many cultural, artifacts from the Arabic people, also the Chinese people. But when we talk about navigation, when we teach oceanography, we forget to mention that, a lot of the Western science also comes from other indigenous communities, global indigenous communities. When we talk about the Polynesians, right, they also navigated the oceans way before the Europeans. So I think that because there's a point in time in our history when Western science became ahistorical, apolitical, and acultural, we always think that, indigenous knowledges go against Western science. But when we look at those histories behind many of the Western science, it's a lot of indigenous direct contributions or indirect contributions. And I think that because of that, nuances where we're at, where science is apolitical, acultural, in the name of objectivity, people forget that, there is indigenous contributions and histories behind many of those concepts or that technology that we now know as modern technology. So I think that it's always important to look back at the history of, the science that we're doing or talking about, so that we can actually realize that, there are indigenous contributions. It's hidden histories, right? It's not acknowledged. So many scientists, we don't know that history unless we actually do more research. But thank you for your question, and I will pass it to
I have a comment. I guess I would say it's also what kind of science, Western science or modern science you're talking about, because systems science, systems thinking gets at a much more integrated, process-based way of approaching the living world and understanding any system in a way that I think reductionist sort of Enlightenment-based thinking really missed out on. And it's a fairly new field. And I would say even in the past 20 years, so much has been learned and is developing in the field of system science. So I would point people in that direction. And there are many resources online to get at this more integrated view that really understands the deeply interconnected nature of reality. It's more in keeping with actually what we know about physics rather than the more simplistic notions of a couple of centuries ago. So I think there is an integration. There's an integrated future, where these things, these ideas can come back together in the more productive, more useful way.
Over here. And I know each of our panelists has something to read towards the end here, so I'll try to time that right.
John, you mentioned at the beginning that we have the word forest, and the words for forest or the concepts for forest or what forest means is very different in the various forests that you've been to. What are some of those other concepts, and what's it matter whether people have different words or different concepts for what a forest is?
Thanks for the question. So one example that we put in the book, I had the chance to sit by a fire in West Papua and ask the person who was my host, how do you say forest? And it's a question I love to ask, and nature too, which is like, they usually don't have a word for it. And she told me 4 or 5 different words, and I'm sure it was the tip of the iceberg. And they had to do with the with the relationship that people had with those ecosystems, what word was used to describe them. And then in the Yukon, I asked the same question, and it took them 2 days, and they did not have a noun for forest. They had a prepositional phrase, which was the best they could come up with, which has to do with a person being among sticks. And so the forest doesn't exist until that relationship brings it into being. And I think it matters because those words encode ideas about how people relate to those places. And if there's any time we need that, it's now. It's amazing to write a book about forests and try to come up with synonyms. And there really aren't any. You could say woodland, but that's actually a different kind of ecosystem. And so our language is incredibly poor in lexicon for that ecosystem, at least. There was a guy who I interviewed for the book who told me that he didn't believe that caribou could be managed in English, and that they were going to go extinct if they weren't managed in languages of people who had been managing them for thousands of years. So I think that's why it matters.
Over here, and while the mic comes to you, I just want to, I'm remembering a moment where I was at a ceremony with Onondaga elder Orrin Lyons, and he walked around the fire, and when he had finished, he said, I feel that the lacking in this culture now is relationship, is understanding our relationship to this fire. And one of the most beautiful things about each of your books, and I think something that's kind of flowering into our consciousness more now, is the idea of kinship. I think each of your books is really a real beautiful meditation on our relationship and our kinship with every species and non-living, mountains and rocks and rivers and oceans. Thank you for reminding me. But I just want to applaud that, insight that each of you is bringing forward. The Lakota say, all my relations, and it sounds simple, but it's really profound. And so I just want to thank you for that. And I think we have this one more question, and then we'll have some readings to go out with.
So a quick question for Dr. Hernandez. I really appreciate you pointing out that in traditional education, traditional environmental knowledge is science. And I was wondering what kind of difficulties you've been having in academia, getting academic scientists to acknowledge that. And is there a growing understanding in academia that Indigenous peoples around the planet have very highly evolved science, and highly evolved for thousands of years?
Yeah, thank you for your question. And I think that the reason why I use Indigenous science as opposed to traditional ecological knowledge is because in many spaces, when I bring up traditional ecological knowledge, scientists kind of fixate on the traditional. So they continue to speak about Indigenous peoples in the past tense, as opposed to in the present, or talking about our Indigenous futures. And as a result, one of the things that I push is that it is a science, right? It's just not through the linear scientific method where, we collect numerical data. Our data is more of oral stories. It's more of our ceremonies. It's our prayers, our songs. So we're not going to have that numerical data. And as, anything, our environments have changed. And we're, as Indigenous communities, right? Not that we are monolithic, but all of us still have some of that knowledge of our environments. It's just that it has adapted, like science has adapted with new information, nuances with the technology, right, that has been introduced. And I think that what I'm seeing is that we are seeing a wave of Indigenous science actually being recognized. And I think that with this administration, we're seeing how representation is kind of pushing that narrative for Indigenous knowledges to be recognized with Deb Haaland. But, there's still long ways that we have to go. And I think that, we are in a, like I mentioned, that gray area where we all have to take that action to push further so that we don't just become, a hashtag or a movement. We actually become a movement, right? Where we can bring forward the 7 generations where, they don't need to be invalidated. Our Indigenous sciences are going to be acknowledged. But I'm going to pass it to John as well.
My only comment I'm not in academia, but I see academics in the field, and they always have a local person with them. And their first PhD is really everything they learned from the local person. And they're also powerful partnerships between Indigenous communities and scientists that I don't know I struggle with what the right word is. I don't, Western isn't really a good word. Modern is sort of strange, but trained in university science. And For example, the Indigenous protected areas that are being designed in Canada are usually a fusing of traditional law and ethics and instruction and knowledge with these other streams of knowledge that come out of universities and help sort of check bureaucratic boxes, but also are born from a beautiful tradition of observation. And it's really intense observation of two different kinds.
So we'll finish with each of you reading, Christina, then John, then Jessica, okay?
So the passage I'm going to read is about a word, transilience, and it's a counterpoint to resilience, which gets a lot of airplay in climate change circles, which it really connotes to me more of a bouncing back or incremental change which is thinking small, right? Transilience is jumping forward. And so it's a term I'm reappropriating from geology, where it refers to the change in strata of rock, a sudden shift where you see that slice in the rock. That's transilience. And that shows a radical shift in time and in substance. And that's what I think we're after right now. To become transilient, we must acknowledge the damage we have already done and the irreversible changes that will roll out for decades, regardless of our current actions. We must shape equitable, flexible new systems and structures that can better adapt to the changes that are coming. And we must invent and invest in the means to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and ocean in order to move our climate back toward dynamic equilibrium. A millennium from now is unimaginable in so many ways, but it is the blink of an eye in terms of climate, evolution, and natural systems. The generations alive today will play a large part in determining what that planet will look like. So many of the research papers I have read conclude with climate scientists saying, in language tinged with despair, that the only possible solution to the losses they are observing is for societies to reverse global warming. Experts say the 2020s are our last best chance to put the genie back in the bottle. We must start before we feel ready and keep going when we are tired. We come from the sea. We are fish out of water. Salt water runs through our veins, and most of the oxygen we breathe is produced by marine microorganisms. We are in an intimate, elemental relationship with the ocean that sustains us and binds each to all. Returning the ocean's body, and our own, to health is ultimately about writing a new story about our place in the world and then becoming characters in it. What will our descendants say of us in 100 years, in 1,000? In the words of Jonas Salk, are we being good ancestors? In the geologic future, our era will show up as a layer of sediment made from steel, concrete, and plastic. What layer will come after it? In writing this book, I have learned so much about people who are already helping to mend the fabric of the planet, even as others tear it further. There will be suffering in the decades to come, especially for the young, old, poor, marginalized, and vulnerable. And there will also be tremendous opportunity for creative engagement in cultural transformation. What we do and when matters.
What I'm going to read comes at the end of the prologue, which summarizes some of those policy approaches that I talked about earlier. And it goes like this. These strategies hold promise for a future in which vibrant, planet-sustaining forests will benefit the lives of descendants so distant they won't know our names. But saving the megaforests requires more than strategy and tactics. This is a job that needs to be done with feeling. In the modern world, the beings and features of the forests and even the forests themselves are commonly thought of as objects. We humans are separate subjects acting upon them, and nearly all verbs, if we think of this grammatically, are ethically tolerable. Cut, dig, clear, gather, manage, thin, burn. This separation is rare among forest peoples. Little Anastasia Momo, who is a character who appears in the very beginning of the book, little Anastasia Momo's family may go back 50,000 years in New Guinea's forests. Like most clans here, the Momos have an origin story reaching into a pre-human realm. They identify black cockatoos, like the ones flying around us on this hillside in the Tambrau Mountains, as ancestors. Nearby clans ascribe that role to tree kangaroos or masked snakes, creatures with whom long unbroken lines of ancestors have shared the forest shade. People we've met over the years and others we interviewed for this book repeat refrains about kinship and obligation to the various forms of non-human forest life that sustain them. Accounts abound about times when people and animals were fully conversant in the same language. Some still talk. For modern humanity to keep megaforests, and with them the one planet we know of that has any forests, we need to care for the world as if it is family. We need to attempt a grammar in which subject and object, people, and everything else are the same. In a material and evolutionary sense, of course, we absolutely are.
Okay, so what I'm going to read is entitled Decolonizing, Peeling Onions. So I want everyone to close their eyes and imagine you are in your kitchen or in your garden holding an onion in your hand. I often explain decolonization using the metaphor of peeling onions. It is important to mention that colonialism introduced many layers that need to be dismantled. So in order to truly reach decolonization, all these layers must be dismantled. This means that like onions, there are multiple layers embedded in ourselves and our systems that need to be peeled off. As we decolonize these layers, we're peeling layers off from this onion until we get to the core, which is when we truly reach decolonization. Now, when it comes to decolonizing larger systems or entities, such as universities, we're talking about a sack of onions. This means that at larger entities and institutions, decolonizing means undoing more layers and system embedded in these layers. Yes, it takes longer to peel a sack of onions than it does one onion. Like peeling onions, we will shed tears, especially Indigenous peoples who have to deal with settler colonialism that started with the genocide of our people and is still an ongoing genocide that is taking place. Getting to the core of the onion means that there's a lot of tears that we have to shed. Thank you, Paducci.
Thank you all very much for your beautiful words and books, and thank you all for being here. I'd like to remind you all, please buy these great books at Sausalito Books by the Bay in a tent by the park starting at 4:45. Thank you all for being here.